what did you find in some of your research there, and what these owners and capitalists thought would be the best way for them to get profit out of any women's league?
Yeah, so I think that women's football, the men who started these teams, as you said, it really was a gimmick. And someone like Sid Friedman, who was a promoter, he's had this huge influence on the game of women's football, and it wouldn't exist today without his vision. But at the same time, he was really in it to make money, and he did not really care as much about how the women were represented in the press and how he was going to do it. If it was going to make him money, he was in. And so for him, having these women wear potentially like tearaway skirts, and he would, send photographers from Hustler magazine to practices, and they'd like get under the center to try to get photographs, things like that. He just saw it as part of promoting this outfit that he, this vision that he had and whatever it took. And so there was a very like exploitative element to that. And the reason that many of the women broke off and decided to go independent was because they did not want to be exploited, and they wanted to be taken seriously as football players. However, what Sid Friedman and many of the male owners of the NWFL teams, there were some player-owned teams, but most were owned by men. The thing that they failed to realize was that any sports league takes a long time to become profitable, and there has to be a lot of time and investment before there's ever like a return on that money. And a lot of these men, some of them really wanted to see the women's game take off, and others really were in it to make a quick buck. They thought they could bring this to their town, their city, and people would come and they would see profits, within a year or two. Not only is that really just like not how any sports league functions, most take about 10 years to see any profit.
Yeah.
Women's teams in particular, and like a brand new team, often take longer because they're up against, the sexism and the belief that they can't play, and they just don't get the same. And so the NWFL itself was really never given a chance to fully succeed because a lot of the men who had invested, when they didn't see profits right away, they either ran out of money or they weren't willing to put any more in.
And being unwilling to put, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. You can keep going.
No, I was done.
Oh, okay. The being unwilling to stick it out, that is like, that's got to be that's something that's so embedded with misogyny in and of itself, right? Because I think for owners in more established leagues, the owning an all-male team is a point of pride. You're more willing to we saw this through the pandemic. Owners took a hit in the NFL because in many stadiums there weren't any fans, but they stick it out not because of the quick buck element, but because they understand that owning a sports team in one of the 32 teams in the country is it's not like the number one thing you can do for profit, but you become a cultural staple in and of itself, and the unwillingness to stick it out. I mean, I'm curious what your opinions were in terms of just there's misogyny in that, and then it also perpetuates the misogyny in culture the longevity is so fleeting, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the NWFL was up against so many factors, not having the time investment, not having the money investment, two main things that men's leagues are afforded and have always been afforded that women's leagues haven't. The fact that football is such we said earlier, a masculine coded sport. But then you also have the fact that the men's teams in the NFL had already been around for a while. There were already established fan bases. And then you had college football to that, where those fans travel and follow the players from college to the pros.
And so those players don't get paid to talk about another exploitative
system. So women's football players were up against all of that. How can you expect fans to go to a game once and come and become invested in the Houston Hurricanes when they have no tie? There was no time to build up that fan base. And the fact that some of the owners didn't even consider that or weigh that as a factor. I mean, novelties wear off. The curiosity of going to see women play a game, that wears off after one or two games, and then you're like, okay. And that's sort of what happened. People moved on because the curiosity wore off. But you need that time to establish the fan base, and they just weren't given that.
There's no infrastructure for women's football, right? I mean, I was just listening to a football podcast the other day about how many great quarterbacks and receivers are coming out on the draft, because those are the stars. And like in high school games, quarterbacks are it's not like the old days where it's run game focused. Quarterbacks are throwing the ball 30, 40 times a game in high school games, and receivers are getting those reps. And so like, that's why you see all these high level quarterbacks and receivers coming out in the draft. It's not like this natural thing where there's just like human beings that are plucked and they're Joe Burrow or Patrick Mahomes exists. No, it's because there's infrastructure for those specific kinds of players. There's none of that for women, not just in football too. I mean, like it could be better in other sports, but Matt, our producer, points out that little leagues have state funding. They can help in terms of fostering talent for baseball. There's none of that for women's football, and very little of that for women's sports in general.
Yeah. And if we think about the time period for the NWFL, if we talk about this league specifically, they started in 1974. And we know Title IX was passed in 1972. And so most of the women who were playing in this league did not benefit from Title IX. So they really didn't have much of organized sports at all that they played coming up as kids. And many of these women were athletes, right? They loved the game of football. They grew up playing it with their brothers, with the neighborhood boys. They played pickup games, but that was their only exposure to organized football. And so you have fans come to what is being advertised and billed as a professional football game, and they're expecting NFL level talent. And the women were akin probably to a good high school team, but that to just say that takes it out of the context of they're picking up this game as adults. They're learning the fundamentals as adults. And many of them, because they were lifelong athletes, are quick studies, but they have not had that same pipeline and that same investment in infrastructure. And I want to be very clear that it is not a talent gap. It is not because women are incapable of playing at the same level or that they lack skills. It's an investment gap, and it always has, and it's it still is that way. A lot of the women who play semi-pro football today, some of them will play as kids. The number of girls who are playing organized football is going up, but the majority of the women playing in the semi-pro leagues, even today, they again come to the game as adults. They're lifelong athletes who discover that there's a football team and they always wanted to play. And so they show up. And so it is still exists today. There's absolutely a lack of infrastructure.
Yeah, and just to build on to what Britni just said, the pipeline, we're seeing a pipeline being created from those amateur women's football leagues, because some of the women coaching in the NFL today got their start playing in those leagues and getting that experience that men often say is required to coach at the college and pro level. And because they were actually on the field and got that experience, they were given opportunities at high schools, then colleges, and then eventually have landed in the NFL. So we can see the possibility of a pipeline being established. And if that is developed even further back, at the youth and then at the high school level, giving women an opportunity to get involved in the game and get exposed to the game at an even younger age, then that pipeline will grow. And I'm not necessarily talking about tackle football, because it doesn't have to be that. It can just be flag football. It can be some sort of way that the rules of the game and the elements of the sport can still be there and exist.
Well,
So
in tennis, Yeah, I mean it's like silly. In tennis, they only play 3 sets in women's tennis, and in men's they play 5. Like there's not it's not an all or nothing proposition in terms of playing this game. There are different rules. The XFL has different rules. College football has different rules. Rules changes happen all the time, and it can be different for a women's league 100%. I wanted to ask your both of your opinions on homophobia's role in the NWFL not getting off the ground to the degree that it could. I mean, I'd imagine that there were a lot of gay players, or you did write that, and there was homophobic responses to them playing the sport. I mean, what was some of what you found in interviewing these former players, and also in terms of the archive research that you did?
Sure. I think, we assumed there would be some players who were gay, and we didn't know how many would want to talk about it and whether they would see it as connected to their time in the league. And what we discovered was that many of the gay players who were in the NWFL really did see their queerness and their time in this league as very connected. And that is, because there's estimates, not every player was gay, of course, but somewhere between 50 to 70% of the teams were gay. And those women, some of them knew each other from the local gay community. This is the 1970s. It is not as socially acceptable to be openly gay. So many of the players who were lesbians knew each other from their local bars. Some of them found out about the teams through their local bars where they organized softball leagues and things like that. And so in many ways, the teams they served as an extension of those communities. I think marginalized folks are really good at finding ways to create safety in a hostile world. And this is another example of that, is that the players really found a way to be together. And because there were so many of them, they could be openly who they were. However, they were also up against systemic and societal homophobia. And so there's a lot of fear of, you don't want to advertise yourself as, being a lesbian. There were some teams who were afraid to allow the local lesbian bar to buy an ad space in the program because they were worried that they wouldn't be seen as family friendly if they were associated with that bar. Sometimes there would be homophobic slurs yelled at them while they were practicing. Some of the media coverage really wanted to paint them as a bunch of lesbians, and so they were really up against that. And I think we see that today too. The WNBA has long wrestled with a lot of homophobia as well, and trying to counteract that. But I do think that the queer history of the 70s and of this league kind of can't be erased from the narrative of it as a whole.